Hello and welcome to the second edition of In Conversation from Global Digital Foundation. Under its Digital Services Act, or DSA, the European Union is proposing a brand new layer of regulation and enforcement aimed at protecting Europeans, both as consumers and citizens. And that, I think, is an important distinction. As consumers, the intention is to protect people from unscrupulous or sloppy trading practices online. At the same time, the DSA intends to protect Europe's citizens from hateful speech and disinformation. We're joined by Fredrik Erixon from the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. And Fredrik is a Swedish economist. He is co-founder and director of the European Centre for International Political Economy. He was educated at the University of Oxford, the London School of Economics, and Uppsala University. He's worked as an advisor to the British government, as an economist for the World Bank, and he was chief economist of Timbro, the Swedish free market think tank, having begun his career in the office of the Prime Minister of Sweden. He's also the author of several books on economic issues, and I understand you've been described as one of the most influential people in Brussels, Fredrik. Anyway, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here.
My pleasure, Paul.
You've written a note on the Digital Services Act, which says that there are a number of things wrong with it. What are they?
Well, I mean, to start with, let's just sort of broaden the discussion a bit and say it's not just the Digital Services Act. I mean, the DSA, as it's called, I mean, it builds on not just the e-commerce directive that it purports to change, a directive that came early in the noughties and was pretty important in helping the development of the entire digital development that we've seen since then, basically confirming that there is an exemption to liability for platforms. And this, of course, was a development that was important given that we had a couple of cases in Europe in the 1990s when network providers, telecom operators, was basically charged by having things going on the networks which were illegal. So this was a very important directive that came in the early noughties and helped to sort of unleash the entire development with not just e-commerce, but with platforms like Facebook or YouTube. Ever since then, there's been a development of trying to rein in the liability exemptions that were offered in that directive. We've had specific legislation. Some of them are highly motivated, for instance, when it comes to terrorism and fighting terrorism. We've had code of conduct, so code of practices that have been related to disinformation or misinformation. And we've have different others on copyrights, on many other things that have been sort of restricting the ability to engage in exchange on platforms, and regulations that have prescribed behavioral rules for what you need to do, what type of practices you need to have in place if you want to do business there.
This is a new level, isn't it?
Well, this is a new level, and I think it's not just the DSA. I mean, we had just 2 weeks ago now, there was a new guidance coming from the European Commission on the code of practice on disinformation, which I think points us very clearly in what directions that regulations are going to go in the future. So this is something that builds on what is sort of a bit euphemistically been described sort of as self-regulation from the industry itself. Now we're talking about co-regulation, and if we follow the sort of evolution of the DSA, I think it's fair to say that we're going to see full regulation coming in the future on what we see in that code of practice as well, or the guidance in that code of practice, simply because there is sort of a very, very strong trend right now, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world right now, to basically try to restrict the ability for platforms to host different type of opinion, not just legal opinions or legal views or legal content, but to host other type of content that may be objectionable. I may not like it, but still, I don't think that you should use the power of governments in order to force these platforms to take these messages down. So that is basically the context that I'm worried about. And then I'm in this note, I'm pointing to a couple of problems with the DSA. We can go in to talk about them if you like, but my main concern is basically that we are now stretching even further the rules and regulations that apply on platforms. This is being sold as, you know, a way for politicians to take back control from the platforms, but it's doing none of that. It's just going to hand even more power to the big platforms in the future.
I mean, my sense or my read of the mood of European politicians and European policymakers, both at national and at the EU level, is that they are suffering from a kind of collective anxiety that's really stems probably from, well, the last 5 years, let's say. And this is that they fear extremism online, they fear populism, and they want to find ways to keep the discourse, as it were, in Europe within acceptable bounds. And this, I think, is coming up against, and so in that sense, because I note that in your short paper, you question as to why they would want to give more power to platforms. And it struck me as I read this that yet maybe for some of them, at least, this is a kind of an unconscious or a subconscious trade-off, that they don't mind giving power to platforms because they are very anxious about extremist content online or politically disruptive content online.
I think that's true, and it's something that I think it's a worthwhile, a noble concern to have. It's just that I don't think, I mean, the model they have in mind is basically you have innocent citizens that suddenly go online and get exposed to nasty political views, and then they start to accept or harbor these nasty political views themselves. And I simply don't think that that model is true. And
that's an accepted paradigm. I mean, that is very much an accepted paradigm, you know, by political elites and political theorists almost worldwide, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, if you actually look at the research that takes place, when now there's sort of quite a lot of research going on, basically sort of on filter bubbles or sort of tribalism online, looking at influence peddling online, etc. And what we find is it's not actually a clear-cut case. And I think sort of the underlying assumption here as well is that you don't accept individual agency. You think that individuals are these innocent bystanders that suddenly sort of get captured by a political view and then they start to harbor it. What usually happens is that people tend to have some of these views to start with, and for a variety of reasons, confirmation bias, etc., they search up online content that confirms their political views. So it's even if I can fully understand why some platforms voluntarily, without government pressure, are taking measures in order to make online platforms a hospital place for different users. I think sort of the model behind government stepping into this, I think it's well, in the first place, it's premature because they're acting on knowledge that they simply don't have, where research are contradicting them. And in the second place, I don't think it's going to be a successful way of dealing with this problem. I don't think we have a sort of a switch, an online switch that we can move a little bit and suddenly we're going to change the political views of people that have become populist or sort of fascist, anti-immigrant, or whatever concern we have. I mean,
there are two truths here, I think. The first thing is, I'm inclined to agree with you that people, you know, when they witness extreme content or see extreme content, it's not like being exposed to radiation, you know, where you then become sort of irradiated, as it were, with this content. I had a very similar, we had a very similar exchange on this exact point, actually, with Jacob Mashangama a few weeks ago, where I recalled from reading the historian Richard Evans, the British historian Richard Evans, who in fact I think became quite well known when he gave evidence at I think the Richard Irving case, the David Irving case, I think it is, who was the sort of Holocaust denier or downplayer. And Evans's trilogy on the history of the Third Reich, I mean, in it he does observe that the Germans were no more, after almost 10 years or more than 10 years of anti-Semitic propaganda in 1945, the Germans in general weren't any more anti-Semitic than they had been in 1933. and that, the idea that now this wasn't Evans' central point, but it's a point of interest to me, that the idea that the propaganda itself caused the terrible crimes that the regime committed, doesn't really quite hold water. The propaganda was correlative, certainly, and so. But I think that's an important truth. But a second truth is the one that you've mentioned, which is that when you push extreme content off mainstream platforms, it then goes on to smaller platforms, where in fact you then get the echo chamber. Is that your point?
Yes, that's right. I mean, and I think that's the main point of my paper, which is that nasty views don't go away just because they aren't allowed to be expressed on Facebook or on Twitter. They just migrate to other type of platforms. And I mean, there are two consequences that will arise when you do that. The first one, of course, is that if you were a fascist organization that were using sort of platform in order to get new sympathizers or adherents to your organization, it's going to be more difficult because you're not allowed to be there. But when you move to other platforms, and these platforms can be smaller, what is generally called alt tech platforms like MeWe, Parler, and others, you get much more of an echo chamber. You can see that these organizations tend to radicalize. They are certainly less exposed to alternative views. I mean, one of the things that happens if you start to peddle different opinions on Facebook or Twitter is that someone is going to argue against you. And that is one of the beauties of these platforms, in the sense that even if you can design your network yourself a little bit, you can always rest assured that if you have one opinion, you're going to hear 3 or 4 different people responding to your posts or your contributions that take a very different view of things. And you don't get that if you go on to all tech platforms where you just sort of you and your sort of closest political friends that are there.
I mean, one of the things I guess policymakers are anxious about is the role of algorithms on platforms, which are serving up information that tends to confirm the kind of stuff you're already interested in, and which can sort of enhance this echo chamber, maybe effect on whether it's on Facebook or whether it's on YouTube or other kind of channels like that. And that I think one of their concerns, I guess, is that when free speech advocates talk about this being a virtual public square, the implication being that your views are tested in the marketplace of ideas. And they would say, well, actually not quite, because the platform has its thumb on the scale of this and is actually, the platform itself doesn't see it that way. The platform blindly sees clicks and advertising and time on the site, as it were. I mean, do they have a point in that sense?
No, I mean, I think they certainly have a point when it comes to the algorithm and the technology itself. And I think anyone who has used any of these platform services will realize that after a while you're basically getting served what you you get served the different posts and the different views that seems to be in the same sphere of interest as you have signaled in the past. Now, I mean, we can have sort of a good discussion whether this is something that platforms should do anything about, but I think we should expand that discussion to include even newspapers. I mean, most of the newspapers that I use today have similar type of algorithms which basically serve me their content that I've signaled that I've been interested in the past. But I think sort of getting back to my fundamental point here is that I don't think this is a legitimate policy for government to pursue. I think sort of this is a good discussion to have among platforms, to have among newspapers and the broader media about what can we do in order to help to shape conversation which is going to be a lot more pluralistic, that is going to sort of offer counter views and just different views to the ones that you usually get exposed to depending on your algorithm. So yes, indeed, but it's not a government objective here.
I mean, I suppose if you ask a lot of people in Brussels, they would tell you as an axiomatic truth that fake news is what was behind the election of Donald Trump. Fake news is what was behind Brexit, and therefore we have to suppress disinformation or fake news, and anything that does that's got to be a good thing. Now, I don't think there's really any evidence that fake news is responsible for Donald Trump or responsible for Brexit, but I think they've convinced, a lot of policymakers have convinced themselves that this is the case.
Yeah, no, and I think this is the highly self-serving explanatory model that many politicians have used since the Brexit referendum or the election of Donald Trump or any other populist victory that we've seen over the past 5-7 years. But I don't think it's just stand up to scrutiny. And I think sort of there is, you know, philosophically, academically, or just sort of a conversation among citizens. I mean, there is a good conversation to have here about what has been going on when we have eroded some of the hierarchies that existed previously for serving citizens with news, with views, the old sort of newspaper industry that has, you know, virtually collapsed from sort of the centrality that it tended to have in the past. When we now have a lot more networked information and we have an infrastructure when it comes to the distribution of news and views that are different from the past, I think that's a very good conversation to have. And I think we're also going to find there that sort of the erosion of political centrism or the erosion of traditional establishment elites or powers that we've seen, that has been substantially been driven by the fact that many of these hierarchies have, if not fallen, so at least they have much less power than they had in the past.
And I think so also, I mean, they themselves aren't, I mean, the establishment media, I guess, and a lot of mainstream politicians have not shown themselves to be completely immune from questionable narratives either, when it comes to, you know, stating their position or stating their opposition to views that they dislike. It's not. I mean, there was a comment made by Wall Street Journal opinion writer Dan Henninger, and he said that, you know, maybe part of the reason why so many people in America believe that Joe Biden stole the election is because so many people on the other side, you know, have said so many things that aren't really true either. And so what you have really is a kind of a low trust environment. But it isn't all down. It isn't all down to QAnon and Donald Trump and
no, exactly.
fringe platforms.
No, exactly. No, and I think we can point to several examples in Europe as well, where politicians hasn't exactly been sort of generous with the truth and generous with sharing, you know, the information that is relevant, where they have been sort of making up things as they have went along. I mean, from my home country, I mean, there was sort of an expression that was used quite often in the past, which about one particular party, which was that, can we trust that they are lying? So they're most likely going to get elected, but can we trust that they are lying? Because what they said sort of in election campaigns were perfectly obvious not true, and they were sort of making things up. So this is not, I mean, in the first place, this is not a new phenomenon. Even if things have expanded a lot with online platforms, and even if things have gone a bit crazy after especially the election of Donald Trump, we have a situation right now where we cannot just have an arbiter of truth, someone who is going to be centrally positioned in order to edit whatever opinion that goes online and just assume that that's going to be true, the truth.
Your note didn't really allude to the structure that's going to enforce the DSA, or behind the DSA. You have the national digital coordinators, you have the trusted flaggers who they will essentially license, and these trusted flaggers then will have a right to have their notifications dealt with early by platforms. And then you have a sort of a, beyond that, you have, obviously you have professional auditors who are examining sorry, I'm revealing my hand here, because who are auditing risk, as it were, systemic risk. Now, I did say to some colleagues of mine, systemic risk is simply a euphemism for disinformation. From the point of view of it only means disinformation, as it seems to me, as in disinformation will destabilize, and hate speech, which will destabilize our society and so on. And that this sort of extended, they also alluded, I think, to experts and people like that, and this extended group of people who are responsible for oversight, to me, I thought was very, very strange, because especially if you take the trusted flaggers. Now, if you take the trusted flaggers maybe as the kind of point people or point men, the sort of front line, let's say. Well, who are the trusted flaggers? I mean, are they going to be NGOs? Are they going to be people who are representing single identitarian causes, who have their own stakeholders to deal with, and who are going to be bigging up the bad stuff that they see? I mean, is that infrastructure not a bit worrying?
I think it is worrying, and I think it's also it's an area where it's very difficult to do anything at the European Union level, because we don't have a common free speech code in the EU. I mean, we have fundamental rights when it comes to free speech, but how we practice this around Europe in different member states varies a lot. I mean, there is currently a case going on, again, using my mother country as an example, where the Commission is now threatening with taking actions for Sweden not introducing sort of the hate speech law in the way that was intended, because it is not a crime in Sweden to express views around anti-Semitism in the same way as it is prohibited to do that in Germany or other countries, where you obviously would see that there's a sort of a completely different historical context here. So, I mean, my point is basically that we probably need to find much more of a national orientation here, just for the simple fact that we don't have a free speech code around Europe. So we need to build on the institutions we have for free expression and free speech in different countries, and they look very, very different. You're going to have sort of media institutions, some are self-regulatory institutions, some are government institutions, and I think they are the ones we need to build on in order to try to find a way to come to an agreement what platforms should do and shouldn't do when it comes to censoring.
Because to be clear, I mean the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is in its current draft is saying to member governments, hate speech, disinformation, you decide. But whatever it is, it's illegal. And that might mean a very different thing in Warsaw than it does in London or in Stockholm.
Oh, absolutely. There are huge differences between countries here. And this is why, I mean, the problem that is confronting the EU is basically, we don't have a common free speech code in Europe. So what can we do then in order to try to get, in the first place, more harmonization in sort of in a horizontal way for the EU? I mean, that's typically the way that the EU thinks about the issues, and they do that for good reasons. The other thing is basically, so we cannot have regulations on content itself unless we're talking about terrorism or talking about expressing views that are illegal to express. So then they try to get around that by introducing different type of commercial type of laws and commercial behavioral practices on platforms that have basically the same intent or the same consequences, which is that all these platforms, in order to minimize risk, they're going to start to moderate a lot more. They're going to take away lots of different opinions where they don't know if it is legal or not legal. They don't know if there is objectionable or harmful content in there, but they simply need to take it down in order to avoid these steep penalty risks that exist.
Yes, I was kind of trying to think of I was writing about this, and I was trying to think of it's like something from Hegel or Foucault or something, or Adorno, where you have the Commission's concept of systemic risk, and then through the kind of a sort of a magical dialectical process, they feed this into corporations, which transforms it into something called corporate risk. And of course, once it becomes corporate risk, they're doing exactly what you're saying. It's going to be erring on the side of caution, listening to their lawyers who will say, 6% of they can fine you 6% of our turnover if we are really not playing ball with them. So we don't want to go down that path. So do we take this guy's video off YouTube? Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a no-brainer.
Absolutely. I mean, there is no income you have that can motivate taking a risk to maintain something online. You will take it down. And sort of my worry here, I mean, sort of, you mentioned systemic risks and the way that it's being treated in the DSA. I mean, this is really an insidious concept itself, because when you see how it's treated in the DSA, it becomes a bit, I mean, in the first place, it's legally unclear. What is a systemic risk? I mean, what do you mean as a regulator when you put this into the regulatory proposal itself? The other way is to look, so how do platforms right now deal with systemic risks? I mean, they have algorithms that are going to scan through what is being expressed on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And then they run into the problem, which is that, well, these are not very sharp tools in order to capture what we want to capture. We're going to capture a lot more than we want to if we're going to use these algorithms. So what do we do then? Well, we find ways to start to look for individuals. So people that may have been expressing a viewpoint in one particular area that are sensitive, suddenly you become a lot more interested on what views they're going to start to express on other issues. And even if we're talking about in the DSA about a general prohibition or a prohibition against general monitoring, this is where platforms are going. And of course, the Commission knows this perfectly well, that this is the only way we have right now to try to capture opinions that may include something which is illegal. You start to monitor individuals.
When you do, and the platforms in essence start to not necessarily collude, but they will follow each other in removing individuals from the platforms as kind of policy, and the explanations aren't very, very clear as to why they're doing it. I mean, Donald Trump, obviously, we well known, was taken off Twitter, and I think then they've given him a 2-year ban after that, and there's no clear reason, why that should be now that the election's all over and it's all done and dusted, and the capital is not being invaded and that kind of thing. So that is I think what the DSA is harnessing is obviously the platform's own desire to prevent what you economists call negative externalities, as in the platform itself starts seen to be hosting content that's bad, or it's going to get them into trouble, and so they're trying to remove this kind of stuff. But this has an effect on the public square, if that's what they are, because it does narrow the discourse somewhat, does it not?
Oh, absolutely, it does. I mean, we basically get to a point where the government doesn't ban you to hold or express a certain type of views, but they restrict your ability to communicate with other people what that particular view is. And that may be legitimate if we're talking about political views that are illegal. I mean, you can't sort of incite hate crimes in any country. I mean, that's expressing that type of view is illegal in most countries. But now we're talking about also censoring and restriction the expression of views that they are harmful and they are objectionable in my viewpoint. But I don't want any government to take any measure that limits their ability to communicate their views.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, are you aware of any pushback at the member state level against some of these things? Or is this problem that you identify on the radar of national politics in Europe?
I mean, strangely, the DSA itself, I think, is almost completely absent from the debate in most member states. There are a few countries, Poland, France, and others, where governments have taken action, and as a consequence of that, they have also stoked reactions to the measures that have taken. There are some governments, I mean, the Polish government, obviously, that were trying to use this in order to sort of brand or at least do things that they think were going to go down well with their supporters. So this was basically a government who was saying, you know, you have all these leftist platforms that are always censoring your views. Now the EU wants to come in and censor your views even more, and you basically belong to our traditional electoral base, so we're going to cover your back, and therefore they introduced their own symbolic measure, which was that any censoring of political views is banned if it's done online in these countries. But in most other countries, the debate is almost totally absent. It's extremely difficult to engage policymakers in member states to have a dialogue of this, and this is partly because I mean, as you said initially, that many of these governments, they want to have more restrictions on the platforms, but they don't want to be responsible for it themselves, because if they are, they're probably going to face national political reactions. For some, I think it's too complicated to understand. I think since you're not putting forward a proposal here, which is about the freedom of speech, or, you know, what are we going to do in order to find a hospital environment online? This is, you know, a revised e-commerce directive. I mean, it sounds like it's about something completely different. And then you deal with this issue at the same time as you're trying to deal with, you know, typical consumer rights perspectives when you transact or you do business online, etc. I mean, it all gets very, very blurred. And
yes, I mean, certainly the Commission does seem to be putting all in the same bucket. You know, hate speech, disinformation, platform businesses that aren't revealing who they are online and therefore trading in some kind of fraudulent way or using kind of, and it's all the same kind of problem.
Yeah, no, it's what they call a horizontal regulation. So they see this as this is the motherboard, and then you can connect lots of different other regulations to the motherboard as we move along. I mean, we talked about the Disinformation Code of Practice. They are self-mentioning the AI regulations, the new sort of the Article 17 and the Copyright Directive. What, you know, how we're going to interpret that. So this is the motherboard, and it includes everything. And I think that makes it very difficult for people to understand, unless you are sort of a typical Brussels policy nerd that follows these issues.
I know you talked about the sort of commercial aspect of this, as in the impact on the development of Europe's digital economy, maybe European platforms, that this is going to have. What was your argument? I think was that these kind of restrictions will entrench incumbent power because the big platforms can afford all this regulatory stuff and the smaller ones can't. And I note also that IMCO, the parliamentary committee, has proposed extending it down to smaller platforms, I think turning over 50 million euro or less. Can you talk a little bit about that, you know, the entrenchment factor here, that it would make it rigid?
Yes, indeed. And I think this follows very much of what I said initially, which is that this is billed as something which is going to restrict the power of the big platforms. And I think it's just going to have the opposite effect, which is they are going to find a way to flip this around and make it an entry barrier for other platforms, smaller platforms, perhaps European platforms that are growing, that want to grow and have the ability to grow and become commercially successful in the future. This is what we've seen throughout the development of new types of digital regulations that have happened. When, I mean, if you recall, Paul, we had the big debate about GDPR from, or was it 2011, and 3-4 years that when that debate was going on, it was sort of entirely assumed that finally we're going to find a way to restrict the power of Facebook and Google, etc. And then sort of what has happened after that? Well, you know, a lot of nuisance, of course, for any user in Europe, all the cookies and all the approvals that you need to get every time you access a website. But most of all, this has just entrenched the power of big platforms, because they have the regulatory capacity, they have the legal capacity, they have the lawyers, they have the money in order to comply with this. But this becomes a big problem for platforms that don't have these resources, that are smaller and that are upstarts that want to get a foothold in the market. And I think this is a problem here as well with the DSA, especially if you add with lots of the other stuff that are coming through the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and then you add all the other stuff that's in the pipeline for platforms or for any digital operator. It's just that the regulatory thresholds to go from being small to become big or very big just gets higher and higher.
I was drafting an article on the DSA and the DMA, and I came up with this idea that what European policymakers are anxious to do is to harness all of the good that comes from digital platforms. And they're doing it a bit like, it's a concept that Freeman Dyson, the British physicist, came up with about surrounding a star with a structure to take all of its energy. So the sort of surrounding platforms like stars with these structures, like a 360-degree, you know, total around them. And they're trying to, you know, get rid of all the bad stuff, the disinformation and the hate speech, but have all the good stuff for the economy. So it's almost like the purpose of the regulation is not just to sort of stop the excesses of the free market, but it's to, as a matter of industrial policy, you know, it dovetails into a wider industrial policy of directing these things for the good of society.
Yeah,
no, exaggeration,
but I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think the objectives behind what the Commission is doing with the DSA, I mean, it's not a bad objective. We can have sort of a different discussion around the DMA, which I think is about a lot more about industrial policy and a lot more about sort of inventing policies that they think are going to sort of hamstring the big American tech platforms and going to create for new opportunities for European platforms to grow, which I think is totally a totally ruinous model that they have for the thinking here. But that's a different issue. But for the DSA itself, I think, I mean, the way I see it is basically this is the last, hopefully the last, it may not be the last, but sort of it's a cry from the past, in the sense that, can we please go back to the type of information society that we had in the past, when, you know, can we get someone to edit the internet? I mean, that's the basic ask which is behind this. And then I think
make it public service. The principles of public service broadcasting.
Yeah, basically. Exactly. And then I think they simply don't understand in what direction that development is going. Sort of that old hierarchical structure, information and opinions, I don't think it's going to come back. The new network structure we have and the consequences that I've had for political hierarchies, for establishment, whether that is business establishment, political establishment, doesn't really matter. But the consequences that the network structure have had for establishment, it will continue. That old structure is not going to come back. And therefore, I think they need to find a different model to think about these things. They cannot sort of pressure this down into a structure where you can have platforms editing the internet or making sure that there's never going to be harmful views being expressed on the internet. It's just not going to work.
It strikes me that the potential for measures like this, especially some parts of the DSA as they apply to speech, it could in fact have the opposite effect that they're intended. When you suppress extremism, it does, as you suggest, it finds other outlets. But not only that, it acquires a kind of a moral allure it didn't have, because of course it's a victim.
Yep.
Now, and this, I think, is something that they're not taking into account. That it at the very least could discredit the European project at a European level, and at the very worst will make politics in some national member states more unstable than they would otherwise be.
I think that is true, and I think this feeds into the broad narrative that upstart political populist parties have used, which is that the elite wants to censor us, they want to take us away, but we are here to defend the opinions of people whose views haven't been represented in the past. And when you sort of add that moral allure that you were talking about, I think their case just gets stronger. I mean, it's one thing if what you're doing online is arguing for the restoration of the Third Reich, and you want to build up an army, and you want to take sort of terrorist actions inside your country in order to topple democratically elected governments. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, that's illegal. It's legal in every country to do that. But most of the stuff that gets censored right now are far away from being that type of opinions. I mean, just look at what has been going on recently with COVID. And I think this is interesting because if you look at the guidance that came from the Commission on this new code of practice for disinformation, it starts very much from the experiences we've had over the past, 13, 14, 15 months living with the pandemic. And then we have the obvious examples with the theory of a lab leak or a man-made virus, which was suppressed by Facebook and others initially. It was a pants on fire statement if you use the PolitiFacts, sort of the grades they use for the Washington Post and others. Similarly, there was an example, and I recall this very much myself because I was involved in a discussion around what is a legitimate restriction of civil liberty during a pandemic. And I was making the point and taking a lot of inspiration from, in this case, the Swedish model for dealing with this issue, which was that there is very little evidence suggesting that schools are going to be hotbeds for spreading the virus, or that children are going to suffer badly if they get affected by the virus. So I think it was important to keep schools open. Now, there was a similar views expressed by a medical doctor in America who was then based at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. And he made a YouTube movie clip about this, where he was speaking at an event about it. And then suddenly he got appointed advisor to Donald Trump, and then YouTube took it down and were basically suggesting that this is a view that you cannot express because it contradicts science. Now we can, I mean, I would never vote for Donald Trump. I don't like people going into work for him, but this is a view that should be expressed, and it was pretty far away from what is a legitimate discussion when we have uncertainty about
I think the problem was
and
that,
the facts here.
Yeah, the problem was, of course, it was, people talked about the science.
Yeah.
And that, I think, was a problem. And I mean, in a way, it is a kind of correlative problem to, I think, the one we're discussing about the idea of determining what is the truth and what is not the truth. Because, whilst we're not relativists, I mean, I think intelligent people are not complete relativists about the truth. We never really believe that we have arrived at the actual essence of the truth. I mean, it's the Popperian view, I guess, the Karl Popper view. And that this idea that there was something called the science, I think, was very strange, because, of course, you're going to have a lot of contending views about it. So that seems to have been something, and it seems to me to be almost an outgrowth of a kind of an anxiety amongst, in a funny way. I mean, Yeah, in a funny way, it was a kind of, I think, a generalized anxiety amongst people who were in charge of things, institutions, civil servants, politicians, and so on. And they all shared this anxiety. And COVID, in a way, manifested it to some extent, that you had to have certain policies. And so certainly, I mean, talking about disinformation. I mean, Sweden, certainly I know that Sweden was being described in some British newspapers, for example, as being like some kind of, hellhole from the, medieval era, where its government were engaging in some very dangerous, primitive practices. Whereas in fact, Sweden had just been doing what they'd always done.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, we were described as we were deliberately infecting people with the virus in order to reach herd immunity as soon as possible. I mean, I think that was the general viewpoint of the Swedish approach to it, but that was, of course, untrue.
Yeah.
No, but I think you're right, Paul, and I think I think this is the problem, and I think that this problem manifests itself in many other different discussions as well, which this concept that there is something called the science, which is different from the scientific method itself, which of course works, as you say, on the Popperian method of conjectures and refutations. That's the only essence of science itself, that we establish a couple of norms for how we present different theses and how we evidence different theses, and then we expose it to an adversarial discussion. You look for people that can help you to refute your thesis.
This is directly analogous, of course, to Hayek's argument about how market economies work. You can almost look at a business like a conjecture, and it's a conjecture until it goes out of business, basically.
Indeed.
If it goes bust.
And it's sort of the decentralized nature of information. I mean, that's how a market works. I mean, we don't have anyone at sort of central level who knows how the market is constructed or in what direction the market is going to go. No one knows this. We have to discover it. And I think it was the same thing with COVID, which was that we were all suffering from uncertainty, and we needed to discover a lot of new things that we didn't know. The last thing we needed was to have sort of a self-proclaimed arbiter of truth coming in and say, no, you cannot say this, or you cannot express this particular viewpoint because for the time being, it goes against what we think the science is. I mean, that's just a horrible way of dealing with uncertainty.
Do you think on a more general level, the world has moved in, and the DSA may be a symptom of that the world has moved towards a more safetyist approach, because you look at organizations. I mean, universities, certainly in the United States, to some extent in Britain, I suspect less on the continent of Europe, are very much riven with this safetyist thing, microaggressions and so on that we've seen, and that, but corporations have their own version of this, in the sense that they are very, safety at work and all these ideas, anti-bullying, of course. I mean, very worthy things, but that it's gone to such an extent now where people are expecting to take no risk doing anything, and that any risk at all is a failure. So we live in a world of the precautionary principle.
Yes, at least we live in a world with one variant of the precautionary principle, which is that we are never going to do anything that can expose us to risk. But sort of the true nature of the precautionary principle is different. I mean, it's not. I mean, better safe than sorry may be sort of a good approach to use when you walk through life, but this is not what we're practicing today. Look, I mean, I think sort of America is always an outlier when it comes to dealing with risk. I mean, I think regardless of what people say about the true nature of the American experiment or the American project, it's a country that I think for decades now has been extraordinarily bad at managing risks. I mean, you just need to step into or step out of a metro or an underground in New York or any elsewhere in America, and you're going to expose to all these safety measures about what you need to do in order to avoid hurting yourself. You're just going to step out of the tube. That's the only thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
And America and corporate America as well have all these sort of strange
they're bought into it.
procedures.
Yeah,
absolutely. They're bought into it, and perhaps to an extent the UK has done as well. But I think you're right, it's different in most parts of Europe. But I think we're gradually moving in that direction ourselves, which is that
it's kind of paradoxical. I mean, that the English-speaking world, or the Anglo-American world, seem to have gone more in favor of this line of thinking, and to kind of thoroughgoing Anglo-American libertarians, this was the kind of vibe. This is what we all thought the Swedish would do, or the French, and but you kind of forget, of course, that people like Hayek were derided in America far more, and Britain far more than they were derided on the continent of Europe. Oddly enough, back in the 40s and 50s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, really. And of course, Keynes was the great savior, the great British economist, and we're all Keynesians now. So it seems that it's a paradoxical thing that the Anglo-American world has gone very much into this kind of safetyist culture, with a more thoroughgoing fashion. Do you think the Americans, and we're running close to time now, but do you think, there has been an accusation made that the Americans are kind of exporting this, via their corporations, via their politics, I guess, and via their media to Europe, where the European continent, despite despite swearing that we will do our own thing, is nonetheless absorbing a lot of this way of thinking, and it's coming from America.
I think that's true, and I think it's not just that they're exporting it. I think there are countries that are willingly importing it as well. So it's not that they are selling this to sort of innocent bystanders in Germany or Austria or Italy that ideally would like to go sort of take a different way in dealing with risks, or dealing with, do we need to have a regulation on how we're going to deal with interpersonal relations? But I think this is true.
I certainly think there's a very important distinction to be made, and I've been saying this for a while. And I am writing it's either a very long paper or a short book on this at the moment about the regulation of speech online. And one of the things I've determined is that no one's making a proper distinction between what I call online incivility and stuff that's just illegal, like threatening people's life, and the distinction really is the proper distinction is between online civility, for example, and then this idea also of extremism. So my own view is that you should be allowed to express views online that are extreme, as long as they're civil.
Yep.
And that it's the incivility, the ad hominem incivility of a lot of stuff online, which maybe is generating the energy, the emotional energy, that's pushing people to kind of unconsciously even agree with anything that regulates online stuff. And I think that's that there's a kind of behavioral aspect of understanding how online discourse works that I think is being ignored.
Absolutely, and I think I think this is a very good model to have for thinking about what I think is something that platforms should do themselves, and they can certainly do this together in different type of self-regulatory bodies, which is to agree on a couple of standards on how do you behave when you're on our platforms. You're free to express an objectionable view, but there are certain limits to your behavior that you need to accept. And if you don't accept them, sorry, you're not going to be able to use this platform.
Finally, what's your prediction about the direction that Europe is going in at the moment with this digital package? I mean, where are we going to be in 5 or 10 years' time, do you think, in Europe?
I mean, I think everything points to that we are going in a direction with a lot more regulation, and a type of regulation which is much more top-down, and it's targeting especially practices that can disrupt either European businesses or disrupt the European political model itself. This is true for what we're doing on copyrights, on AI. You talked about disinformation, the DMA, the DSA, everything is basically pointing in the same direction, which is that there is this model here, which is that we can regulate this top down without generating a lot of negative consequences, either on the economy or on entrepreneurship or on the freedom of speech. And I think we're going to continue down this track for another couple of years before I think there's going to be a change to it.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Fredrik Erixon, Director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about this subject.
My pleasure, Paul.
Thank you very much.